Welcome to Mr. Red Edit. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. Happy viewing.
The morning of my final exams was already stressful enough without the added chaos of family drama. I was sitting at my desk, running through flashcards for one last review when my mother burst into my room. Her expression was hard, her voice clipped. "Pack your things," she ordered. "Sasha needs your room." I froze, trying to process what I just heard. "Wait, what?" I asked, certain I'd misunderstood. Sasha, my half-sister, was 3 years older than me. Growing up, she was always the center of attention, and I'd learned to live in her shadow. But this was different. I knew she was pregnant, but I hadn't expected that I'd be the one forced out of my own home because of it. "Mom, I have finals today," I protested, my voice a mix of disbelief and panic. "You can't just throw me out now." But my mother's face remained stern, unmoved by my plea. "We have to focus on Sasha," she said flatly. "She needs stability right now, and she wants her old room back." I turned to my stepfather, Mike, who was standing in the hallway, arms crossed. "Are you serious?" I asked, hoping for a lifeline, but he only nodded. "It's the best decision for the family right now," he said with an air of finality. "You're old enough to figure it out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own parents were choosing Sasha's comfort over my education, over my future. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how important these exams were, how this was the worst possible timing. But it was clear that their minds were made up. I was out of options. Within a few hours, I was standing outside with my backpack and a hastily packed suitcase, my textbooks shoved between clothes and shoes. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and panic as I stood on the front lawn. I wasn't just losing my room. I was losing my home. I called my best friend, Liam, in a desperate attempt to find somewhere to stay. I could barely get the words out as I explained what had happened. "Can you come get me?" I asked, my voice cracking. Liam's response was immediate. "Of course," he said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." Liam and his family welcomed me with open arms. I was grateful beyond words, but it was still hard to accept that my own parents had tossed me aside so easily. The shock made it hard to concentrate on my exams, but somehow, I managed to push through. I kept telling myself that I couldn't let them ruin everything I'd worked for. The anger fueled me, but the hurt lingered in the background. Liam's parents were incredibly kind, doing everything they could to make me feel at home. His mom made me breakfast each morning, reminding me to take it one step at a time. "You've got this," she would say, her voice full of warmth. And while I appreciated it, the reality of my situation was still a punch to the gut. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my own family could abandon me at such a crucial moment. I tried reaching out to my mother a few times, leaving voicemails asking her to at least talk to me. But she never called back, and each unanswered message felt like another slap in the face. Sasha, too, was silent. I saw her social media posts, all filled with excited updates about the baby, but not a single acknowledgement of what had happened to me. I had always believed that family was supposed to be there for each other, especially during tough times. But here I was, kicked out on the day of my finals, with no idea if I'd ever truly belong anywhere again. Despite the overwhelming support from Liam and his family, the feeling of betrayal was hard to shake. I had to keep moving forward, but the reality was that the people I thought I could rely on the most had let me down in the worst way possible. Moving in with Liam's family felt both comforting and surreal. His parents, Linda and Tom, treated me like one of their own, going out of their way to make me feel welcome. Linda made sure I had my favorite foods, while Tom gave me a pep talk about how life sometimes throws curveballs, but you just have to swing anyway. I appreciated their kindness more than words could express, but the pain of my parents' betrayal lingered like a dull ache that refused to go away. No one from my family reached out to me after I left. Not a single call, message, or even a sign that they cared. I tried reaching out a few times, hoping for an apology, or at least an explanation, but all I got was silence. My mother ignored my calls, and the few messages I sent remained on read. It was as if I'd been erased from their lives completely. I felt replaced, like I was disposable, something to be tossed aside now that Sasha had returned. It hurt even more when I saw Sasha's posts online. Her social media was filled with baby updates, sonogram photos, gender reveals, and excited captions about the new chapter of her life. What stung the most were the comments from my mother, full of heart emojis and exclamation marks, as if she was celebrating a perfect family that I was no longer part of. I couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever think about me, if they ever regretted their decision. Liam tried to keep my spirits up. "You're better off without that kind of toxicity," he'd say, giving me a pat on the back. You're free to start fresh, man. Make something good out of this mess. I nodded, wanting to believe him, but moving on was proving to be more challenging than I'd thought. The initial days at Liam's place were a whirlwind. I had to adjust to a new routine, a new bed, and a new sense of family that wasn't really mine. Linda's warm hugs and Tom's dad jokes helped, but there were nights when the loneliness was overwhelming. I'd lie awake, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life, haunted by the thought that I had no real home of my own. Eventually, I got a part-time job at a local grocery store. The work was mundane, but it kept me occupied. I was grateful to have some income to support myself, even though Linda and Tom never asked me for anything. Focus on saving for your future, Tom would say whenever I tried to contribute to groceries or bills. It was another reminder of how different they were from my own parents, who had pushed me out without a second thought. The months dragged by slowly, marked by significant milestones that I had to navigate alone. My birthday came and went without so much as a text from my parents or Sasha. It was the first time in my life that my mother didn't call, didn't bake me a cake, didn't even acknowledge it. I tried not to let it get to me, but the sadness was hard to shake. Liam's family did their best to make it special. They threw a small party, complete with a homemade cake and a few presents. It was thoughtful and sweet, but it wasn't the same. I was still mourning the absence of the family I'd lost. The holidays were even harder. Thanksgiving felt like a stab to the heart, knowing that my family was likely sitting around the table, laughing and enjoying Sasha's pregnancy stories, while I sat with Liam's family, pretending to be okay. Christmas was just as painful. I scrolled through Sasha's festive photos on Instagram, seeing my mother's comments filled with love and excitement. It was clear where her priorities were, and I wasn't among them. Despite everything, I tried to keep pushing forward. I applied to colleges nearby, hoping to continue my education despite the rough start. Liam's family was supportive of my plans, even helping me with applications and giving advice. "You're going to do great things," Linda would say, her voice full of the motherly encouragement I'd been craving. But I couldn't help but wonder how my life would have been different if my own parents had stood by me. The pain of being abandoned never really went away, but it started to change. It became less of a raw wound and more of a dull reminder that I had survived something I never thought I'd have to endure. I realized that, as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't completely escape the hurt. I'd just have to learn how to live with it. Liam's family continued to be my lifeline, and I found a surprising amount of strength in their support. I didn't have the answers yet, and I wasn't fully over the betrayal, but I was learning to stand on my own 2 feet. I had lost my family in the process, but I was slowly discovering a new kind of strength, one that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. And even though the past still haunted me, I was beginning to see a faint glimmer of hope on the horizon. I was still here, still fighting, and still determined to build a future that no one could take away from me. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang. I was folding laundry in the small room that had become my makeshift bedroom at Liam's house. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But something compelled me to pick up. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Hi, is this Adam?" asked an elderly woman's voice on the other end. There was something warm yet tentative about it, and I couldn't quite place it. "Yes, this is Adam," I replied, still unsure of who it was. The voice hesitated for a moment, then continued, "It's Grandma, dear." I was stunned. I hadn't heard from my maternal grandparents in years. They lived several states away, and I had always assumed they weren't interested in keeping in touch. My mother had often mentioned them in passing, always in a negative light. "They don't care about us," she'd say. "They've chosen to distance themselves." But now, here was my grandmother on the phone, and the sadness in her voice sounded anything but distant. "We just heard what happened," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Your mother told us you had moved out on your own. We had no idea she kicked you out." I couldn't help but feel a mix of shock, relief, and bitterness. She really said that?" I managed to say, trying to process this new piece of information. "Yes," Grandma replied softly. "She made it sound like it was your decision to leave, that you were just being independent." I felt anger rising within me, but I tried to keep my voice calm. "That's not true. She forced me out because Sasha wanted my room. I had nowhere to go." There was a brief pause before my grandmother continued. "We're so sorry, Adam. We should have reached out sooner, but we didn't know the truth." Grandpa then got on the line, his voice deep but full of regret. We tried to mend things with your mother before, he explained. We even bought the house you grew up in, hoping it would help the family. But she and John didn't want our involvement, so we kept our distance. It was surreal to hear this version of events, especially after years of being told that my grandparents had cut us off. I felt both angry and relieved, as if a weight I didn't know I was carrying had been lifted off my shoulders. The conversation continued, with my grandparents expressing their desire to help. We want to make things right, Grandma said firmly. We can't change what happened, but we want to be here for you now. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me felt grateful that someone from my family cared enough to reach out, but another part of me was wary. After all, I had spent the past year feeling abandoned, and I wasn't sure how to let them back into my life. Sensing my hesitation, Grandpa spoke up again. We know this is a lot to process, Adam. We don't expect you to trust us immediately, but we want you to know that we're here for you. Financially, emotionally, whatever you need. Their sincerity was undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. I started to open up a bit, sharing the basics of what my life had been like since I'd been kicked out. I told them about living with Liam's family, working part-time, and trying to save for college. My grandparents listened intently, their voices filled with both sadness and encouragement. As the conversation drew to a close, Grandpa made a surprising offer. The house you grew up in, we still own it, he said slowly, and we'd like to transfer it to you, if you're willing. We know it's a lot to think about, but we believe it's the least we can do. I was floored. I had never imagined that reclaiming the house was even an option. It felt like a bizarre twist of fate. I had been kicked out of that very house, and now it was being offered back to me, on my terms. But the implications were overwhelming. Accepting the offer would mean confronting my parents and Sasha, who were still living there. It would mean taking a stand, not just for the house itself, but for my own sense of dignity and justice. I don't know what to say, I admitted. This is all so unexpected. You don't have to decide right now, Grandma reassured me. Take your time. We just want you to know that you have options, and that we're here for you. After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence for a while, trying to process everything. My grandparents' call had reopened old wounds, but it had also brought a sense of validation that I hadn't realized I needed. I felt conflicted. Part of me wanted to accept their help and reclaim what I'd lost, while another part of me wondered if it was worth the inevitable confrontation with my parents. Later that evening, I confided in Liam about the call. He listened carefully, then said, "This could be a chance to take back what's yours. You don't owe your parents anything after what they did to you." I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I knew that this decision could change everything, but I also knew that I couldn't keep running away from the past. The conversation with my grandparents was the beginning of something new, something that felt like hope. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a choice, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. But I also knew that I'd have to face the people who had hurt me the most, and that was a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready for. But one thing was clear. I was done being silent. A few days after my grandparents' unexpected call, I found myself sitting in the small kitchen at Liam's house, replaying our conversation over and over in my mind. The idea that I could own the house I'd been thrown out of was both surreal and overwhelming. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I'd lost, everything I'd fought to overcome. But now, I had a chance to take it back, on my own terms. My grandparents called again that evening to discuss the details. "We never intended for it to become a source of pain," Grandma explained, her voice filled with regret. "We bought it hoping it would give your mother and John a stable home for you and Sasha. But after what they did, we think it's only fair that you have it now." I sat there, staring at the wall, trying to process the gravity of what they were offering. "You mean, I would own it?" I asked, still unable to fully grasp the reality. Grandpa's voice was firm. "Yes, Adam. We want you to have control. You can live there, rent it out, or do whatever you think is best. It's entirely up to you." It was a huge decision, one that came with both risks and rewards. Taking ownership meant confronting my parents and Sasha, who had never apologized or even acknowledged the pain they'd caused. But it also meant taking a stand, regaining power over my own life, and refusing to let them define me any longer. I knew I couldn't make this decision alone, so I turned to the people who had become my true family, Liam and his parents. We sat around their kitchen table that night, the weight of the conversation palpable. "You have every right to take back what's yours," Liam said, his voice filled with conviction. "They kicked you out without a second thought. Now you have a chance to stand up for yourself." Linda and Tom nodded in agreement. "It's not about revenge," Linda added gently. "It's about reclaiming what was meant for you and setting boundaries that should have been there all along." Despite their encouragement, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. The house held so many memories, both good and bad. It was where I'd spent my childhood, where I'd celebrated birthdays and milestones, but it was also the place where I'd been abandoned. The idea of returning there, even as the owner, filled me with a mix of anger and sadness. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Liam asked, seeing the hesitation on my face. "Because if you're going to do it, you have to be ready for whatever comes next." I took a deep breath, feeling a knot of anxiety in my chest. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted, "but I'm tired of running. I'm tired of letting them win." It was the first time I'd said it out loud, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. The next day, I called my grandparents to give them my decision. "I want to do it," I said, my voice filled with determination. "I want to take back the house." There was a pause, then Grandma's voice, warm and supportive, came through the line. "We're proud of you, Adam. This isn't going to be easy, but you're doing the right thing." They immediately set the legal process in motion. Within a few weeks, the documents were ready. I found myself standing in a lawyer's office, signing the papers that would officially make me the owner of my childhood home. As I scrawled my name across the dotted lines, I felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. I was taking control, but I was also stepping back into a past I'd worked so hard to leave behind. The next step was the hardest, informing my parents that they would have to leave. I wrestled with how to break the news, but there was no easy way to do it. I knew it would be a confrontation, one that would likely end with anger and accusations. But I also knew that I couldn't avoid it. This was my chance to stand up for myself, to set a boundary that should have been set long ago. I decided to visit the house in person, accompanied by Liam, who insisted on coming along for moral support. We drove to the familiar neighborhood, my heart pounding as we approached the driveway. The house looked the same as I remembered, but everything about it felt different. When my mother opened the door and saw me standing there, her expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "Adam, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone wary. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I own the house now," I said, handing her a copy of the ownership documents. "Grandma and Grandpa transferred it to me. You have 30 days to move out." Her face went pale as she read the papers, and I could see the anger rising in her eyes. "How could you do this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "After everything we've done for you?" I felt a surge of anger mixed with sadness. "You kicked me out, Mom. You chose Sasha over me. I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it to take back what's mine." John appeared in the doorway, his face red with rage. "You think you can just waltz back here and take over?" he shouted. But I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. "This is my house now," I repeated firmly. "You need to leave." The confrontation was as painful as I'd anticipated, filled with yelling, accusations, and tears. But I felt a sense of closure, too, a feeling that I was finally reclaiming a part of my life that had been stolen from me. As Liam and I drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. It wasn't the victory I'd imagined, but it was a step forward. I had taken control, not just of the house, but of my own narrative. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I was writing my own story. Driving to my childhood home that day felt like a battle march. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to steady my nerves as I approached the house. The neighborhood was as I remembered it. Kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting on front lawns, and the familiar scent of freshly cut grass. But today, it felt different, more like the setting of a showdown than a homecoming. When I pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding. I took a few deep breaths, trying to summon the courage I'd been building for weeks. I stepped out of the car, the legal documents in my hand feeling heavier than they should. This was it, the moment I had dreaded but also longed for. I walked up to the front door and knocked, each sound echoing my resolve. It was my mother who answered, her face a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Adam," she said, blinking in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was tinged with unease, as if she knew this visit was not just a casual drop-by. I forced myself to stay calm, my voice steady. "I need to talk to you," I said. "Can we go inside?" She hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled the same, cleaning products mixed with the faint scent of coffee, a nostalgic but bitter reminder of the life I'd once known. I found myself standing in the living room, the same room where family movie nights and holiday gatherings had taken place. Sasha was there too, sitting on the couch with her baby in her arms, looking confused but wary. John emerged from the kitchen, his expression quickly turning sour when he saw me. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice already sharp. I took a deep breath and handed the papers to my mother. "I own the house now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Grandma and Grandpa transferred ownership to me." My mother's face went pale as she looked down at the documents, and then her expression changed, first to shock, then to anger. "How dare you?" she yelled, her voice rising. "After everything we've done for you?" She flung the papers back at me, her eyes blazing. John, never one to miss a confrontation, stepped forward, his face red with rage. "You think you can just come back here and kick us out?" he spat, his voice low and menacing. "You're just a kid. You don't know what you're doing." But I refused to back down. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I replied, meeting his gaze head-on. "You kicked me out when I needed you most. You didn't give me a choice then, and now I'm giving you 30 days to move out." Sasha remained silent, her face a mix of confusion and guilt. She held her baby closer, almost as if seeking comfort. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of empathy for her. After all, she had been caught in her own cycle of desperation. But that sympathy quickly faded when I remembered the countless nights I'd spent alone, wondering why my own family had abandoned me. My mother's anger soon turned to a mix of guilt and desperation. "We didn't have a choice," she tried to justify, her voice shaking. "Sasha needed help, and you were old enough to manage on your own." I felt a wave of frustration mixed with sadness. "No, Mom," I said firmly. "You chose to kick me out. You chose to prioritize Sasha over me, and you never even tried to reach out afterward." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and years of unresolved resentment. My mother's face crumpled, but John remained defiant. "You think you're some kind of hero for doing this?" he sneered. "You're just being spiteful." I took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that was bubbling up inside me. "I'm not doing this out of spite," I said. "I'm doing this to take back control of my life. I lost everything when you kicked me out, but now I have a chance to start over." Sasha finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Adam, I didn't mean for things to end up like this." She looked genuinely remorseful, but it felt too little, too late. "I needed help, and I thought they'd figure something out for you." I couldn't help but shake my head. "You didn't think about me at all, Sasha," I replied, my voice tinged with sadness. "You just took what you needed, and I was the one who paid the price." The conversation went in circles for a while longer, filled with accusations, excuses, and pleas for more time. But I stood my ground, repeating my terms firmly. "You have 30 days, I said one final time, my voice unwavering. "I suggest you start making arrangements." As I turned to leave, my mother's voice broke the silence. "Adam, please," she called out, her tone almost desperate. "Don't do this. We're still your family." I paused, the words hitting me harder than I'd expected. I turned back, meeting her gaze with a mix of sadness and determination. "You stopped being my family the day you kicked me out," I said quietly. "Now, I have to do what's right for me." I walked out of the house, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I had done what I needed to do, no matter how painful it had been. As I got into the car, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward. Liam was waiting for me at home, eager to hear how it went. "How'd it go?" he asked, concern etched on his face. I shrugged, feeling emotionally drained. "It was awful," I admitted, "but it was also necessary." He patted my back, offering a reassuring smile. "Sometimes the hardest things are the ones that set you free." And as I sat there, replaying the confrontation in my mind, I realized he was right. This wasn't just about taking back a house. It was about taking back my life. The days following my confrontation with my parents were a whirlwind of emotions and chaos. The moment I left the house, the phone calls began. My mother called incessantly, leaving voicemail after voicemail filled with anger, desperation, and attempts at guilt. "How could you do this to your own family?" she demanded in one message, her voice breaking. "You're tearing us apart, Adam." I listened to the messages, each one more dramatic than the last. But I was determined not to let them sway me. I knew they were attempts to manipulate my emotions, to make me feel like I was the villain. It hurt to hear my mother cry, but I couldn't forget how easily she had chosen Sasha over me. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of empowerment, as if I were finally standing up for myself instead of simply accepting whatever was thrown my way. Despite the heavy burden of this decision, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. I had been carrying the weight of their rejection for over a year, and now I was finally reclaiming my life, one painful step at a time. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting boundaries and taking control of a situation that had spiraled beyond my grasp. My grandparents were a constant source of support during this tumultuous period. They called regularly, offering advice and reminding me that I had done the right thing. "It's not easy, Adam," Grandpa said during one of our conversations. "But sometimes, doing what's right for yourself means making hard choices." They even helped me find a property manager who could handle the house once it was vacated. "You shouldn't have to deal with the logistics on your own," Grandma insisted. I appreciated their practical approach, as it made the entire process less overwhelming. We found someone reliable who would oversee everything: repairs, maintenance, and finding new tenants. Meanwhile, the drama at the house was escalating. My parents made no real effort to leave, dragging their feet despite the looming deadline. They tried to stall by making excuses about how hard it was to find a place on short notice. But I held firm, insisting that they honor the agreement. "You have to be out by the end of the month," I reminded them in a text message. I didn't want to argue anymore. I just wanted closure. Sasha reached out once during this period. Her message was surprisingly calm compared to my mother's frantic voicemails. "I just want to say I'm sorry," she wrote. "I never wanted things to get this bad between us." I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. It was too little, too late. But I replied anyway, keeping it short and to the point. "It's not just about what you wanted, Sasha. It's about what actually happened." By the third week, my parents began to make visible efforts to pack up. It was clear that they were resentful, but they were finally moving. Liam and his family watched from a distance, offering me support and advice. "You've done what needed to be done," Liam's father, Tom, said one evening as we sat on the porch. "It's hard now, but you'll be better off for it in the long run." The end of the month arrived faster than I'd anticipated. My parents left a day before the deadline, vacating the house with little fanfare. I received a brief text from my mother: "We're out." It was a strange moment, anticlimactic and yet deeply significant. I drove to the house that evening, parking in the driveway and just sitting there for a while. The windows were dark, and the front lawn looked neglected, a reminder of everything that had transpired. I stepped inside, the emptiness of the house feeling both heavy and liberating. I walked through each room, taking in the silence. There were remnants of my childhood here. The scuffed floors in the hallway where I'd run as a kid, the marks on the wall from measuring my height each year. But the memories were tainted now, overpowered by the events of the past year. Still, there was a sense of closure that I hadn't felt before. This was my house now, and I had the chance to redefine what it meant. I knew it would take time to let go of the anger and pain, but I was ready to move forward, to create a new chapter for myself. That night, I sat in the empty living room, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I felt a mix of grief and relief. Grief for the family I'd lost and relief for the boundaries I'd finally set. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was mine. The day finally arrived. The deadline I had set came and went, and my parents were forced to pack up and leave the house that had once been the center of our lives. There were no dramatic last-minute pleas, no tearful apologies. It was simply the end of an era, a silent, angry departure. I stood on the front lawn, watching as movers loaded boxes into a truck. My mother and John barely acknowledged my presence. They moved with stiff, robotic motions, their faces hardened by anger and defeat. I caught Sasha's eyes briefly from the window, but she quickly looked away. There was a heaviness in her gaze, a mixture of sadness and resignation, but neither of us spoke. I tried not to let the scene affect me. This was what needed to happen. I had to remind myself of that. I couldn't afford to feel sympathy or doubt, at least not right now. I kept my expression blank, determined not to show any vulnerability. The whole thing felt surreal, like watching a memory play out in real time. When the last box was loaded and the front door closed behind them, I walked up the driveway, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. It was as if a part of me was leaving with them, the part that still longed for their approval, the part that had been desperate for their love. But it was also the part of me that had kept me stuck in a cycle of betrayal and neglect. Letting them go was painful, but necessary. Once they were gone, I stepped into the empty house. The silence was profound, almost deafening. The echoes of my footsteps seemed louder than usual, as if the house itself was adjusting to its new reality. I walked through each room slowly, taking in the memories that lingered in the walls. There was my old bedroom, still painted the same shade of blue it had been since I was a kid. I remembered lying on that bed, staring at the ceiling, dreaming of what life might be like once I was out of this place. But this time, there was no rush to escape. I was finally free to decide what happened next. The kitchen still had the marks from where my mother and I had measured my height each year. I traced them with my finger, feeling a mix of nostalgia and bitterness. I remembered birthday parties, family dinners, and even the mundane moments, like arguing over whose turn it was to do the dishes. These were memories of a life that had once felt secure, but they were now tainted by the betrayal that had followed. The living room was the hardest to face. It was where we'd spent most of our time together as a family, movie nights, Christmas mornings, and lazy Sunday afternoons. I stood in the center of the room, taking a deep breath as I let the memories wash over me. I felt a strange sense of closure, as if I were finally saying goodbye to the past that had haunted me for so long. This house, once a symbol of my family's love and unity, had become a symbol of my resilience. It was a strange transformation, but it was one I was ready to accept. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be moments of anger, regret, and longing for what could have been. But I also knew that I had the power to redefine what this place meant to me. Over the next few days, I started making plans for the house's future. I decided to rent it out, using the income to support my education and financial stability. My grandparents were thrilled with the decision, proud that I was taking such a practical approach. "You're thinking long-term, Adam," Grandpa said during one of our calls. "That's how you build a better life." I spent the next week cleaning and making small repairs, preparing the house for its new tenants. It was hard work, but it felt good to be doing something tangible, something that represented progress rather than pain. Liam and his parents even came over one afternoon to help me paint the walls, filling the empty house with laughter and encouragement. As we painted over the old marks, it felt symbolic, like a fresh start. The house, once filled with echoes of the past, was slowly transforming into something new, a place of opportunity rather than memories. There were still moments when I felt a pang of sadness, like when I stumbled upon an old family photo tucked in a drawer or found a forgotten trinket from my childhood. But I was learning to accept those moments, to let them be part of the story without letting them define me. The night before the new tenants were set to move in, I sat on the back porch, sipping a beer and looking out at the backyard. I thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the betrayal, and the unexpected support from my grandparents and Liam's family. It was a lot to process, but for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I had faced my past head-on, and I was still standing. As I locked the front door for the last time, I felt a wave of emotion that I couldn't quite identify. It was a mixture of pride, sadness, and hope. I knew that I wasn't completely healed, that the scars of the past would always be there. But I also knew that I had taken a major step toward building a life on my own terms. I was no longer the kid who had been kicked out. I was the person who had taken control, reclaimed what was his, and decided what happened next. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was the beginning of something better. With my parents finally out of the house and new tenants moving in, I took my first real step toward rebuilding my life. It felt surreal to know that the rent payments from the house were now mine to manage. It wasn't just money. It was the foundation for a fresh start. I used the income to cover tuition and other expenses, allowing me to focus on my education without the constant pressure of scraping by. My grandparents continued to be a steady source of support. "We're proud of you, Adam," Grandma often reminded me during our phone calls. "You've been through so much, but you're stronger because of it." Their words gave me strength when self-doubt crept in, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this journey. I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that they were now a real part of my life. I had gone from believing I had no family to discovering that I had more than I realized, just not in the way I had expected. Liam's family remained my emotional anchor. Linda's home-cooked meals and Tom's wisdom kept me grounded. "You've got the whole world ahead of you," Tom would say, often over dinner. "Don't let the past hold you back." In a way, they had become the family I had always needed, one that offered unconditional support, not just out of obligation, but out of genuine care. Linda even helped me create a budget to manage the rent income responsibly, teaching me about savings, emergency funds, and planning for future expenses. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," she said proudly. "Now you just need a plan to match." Slowly, I began to find joy in the little things again. Liam and I started going on regular hikes, exploring trails near the outskirts of town. The fresh air and natural beauty became a welcome escape from the heaviness of the past year. We also made a habit of hitting up local cafes, trying different pastries, and talking about everything from school to future dreams. With my finances stabilizing, I allowed myself to explore hobbies I had once abandoned. I picked up painting again, finding solace in the strokes of the brush and the colors coming together on the canvas. It felt liberating to do something purely for myself, without the weight of expectations. I even took a cooking class at a community center, just for fun. It felt good to create something nourishing, something tangible. I also threw myself into my studies with renewed focus. I had enrolled in a nearby community college, aiming to complete my general education requirements before transferring to a university. I chose business as my major, driven by the newfound responsibility of managing the rental property and the desire to build something sustainable. It was a far cry from the aimlessness I'd felt after being kicked out. Now, I had a direction, a purpose. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were moments when the past still weighed heavily on me, like when I saw photos of Sasha's baby on social media or when a mutual acquaintance mentioned my parents in passing. These were painful reminders of the family I'd lost, a family that still existed without me. I couldn't fully erase the hurt, but I had learned to coexist with it, letting it be part of my story without letting it control me. One evening, while sitting in my room at Liam's house, I reflected on how far I'd come. It had been over a year since the day I was kicked out, and the transformation was undeniable. I was no longer defined by the betrayal or the sense of abandonment. Instead, I was defined by my resilience, by my ability to rebuild from the ground up, even when it felt impossible. Liam noticed the change in me, too. "You seem lighter," he remarked one night as we sat on the porch, sipping cold beers. "Like you're finally finding yourself again." I nodded, a small smile spreading across my face. "I think I am," I admitted. "It's weird, but I actually feel good about the future." I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. I was pursuing dreams that were my own, not dictated by anyone else's needs or expectations. The sense of independence was empowering, and it fueled me to keep moving forward. I started making plans for the next steps. I wanted to transfer to a 4-year university, potentially studying real estate or entrepreneurship. I was intrigued by the idea of investing in more properties, of turning the knowledge I'd gained from the past year into something meaningful. The house that had once been a symbol of pain was now a stepping stone to a brighter future. Through it all, I remained grateful for the people who had been there for me. My grandparents, Liam's family, and even a few old friends who had stuck by me despite the chaos. These relationships had become my foundation, the real family I had built from the rubble of the past. I knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments when the old wounds would ache and the memories would resurface. But I was no longer afraid of them. I had faced the worst and come out stronger. I had learned to trust myself, to set boundaries, and to put my own well-being first. As I stood on the porch that night, looking out at the world with fresh eyes, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I wasn't defined by what my family had done to me. I was defined by how I had risen above it. I was rebuilding my life, one small victory at a time, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Because this time, it was on my terms. It had been months since my parents moved out, and I had started to rebuild my life. I was in a good place, studying, working, and finally feeling free from the weight of the past. So, when I got a message from Sasha one evening, I felt a mix of emotions. The message was surprisingly gentle, not like the angry voicemails my mother had left during the move out. "We just want to talk," Sasha wrote. "We want to make things right." I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it and keep moving forward. But another part of me felt a pull, a lingering curiosity about whether they had genuinely changed. I knew that reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but I also knew that holding on to anger wasn't helping me either. After a few days of thinking it over and talking it through with Liam, I decided to meet them. "Just hear them out," Liam advised, his tone cautious but supportive. "It doesn't mean you have to forgive them right away." I agreed to meet Sasha and my mother at a local cafe. When I arrived, I felt a knot in my stomach. The familiar figures sitting at the table felt like ghosts from a different life. Sasha looked nervous, her eyes downcast, while my mother's expression was a mix of guilt and uncertainty. It was clear they were both unsure of how to begin. "Hi, Adam," Sasha said quietly when I sat down. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of resentment and nostalgia. There was an awkward silence before Sasha spoke again. "I'm sorry for everything." Her voice cracked, and I could see that the apology was genuine, at least in that moment. "I was selfish," she admitted, her eyes welling up with tears. "I never realized how much you were affected by what happened." Her words stirred something inside me, an unexpected pang of empathy. I could see that she was carrying her own burden of guilt, but it didn't erase the pain I had endured. "It wasn't just about you, Sasha," I said slowly. "It was about how everyone chose to push me aside for your sake." My mother, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "I know I failed you," she said, her voice low. "I should have done things differently. I was caught up in trying to help Sasha, and I lost sight of you." There was a tremble in her voice, one I hadn't heard before. But while there was regret in her tone, I could also sense a reluctance to fully accept responsibility. It was as if she was trying to explain her actions rather than fully own up to them. It wasn't just about Sasha, she continued. I thought you'd manage, Adam. You were always so strong. Her words felt like a backhanded compliment, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration. You thought I was strong enough to handle being kicked out with no warning? I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. You didn't even check on me once after I left. My mother's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability behind her defenses. I'm sorry, she repeated, tears forming in her eyes. I really am. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I appreciated the sentiment, but it wasn't enough. This isn't something that can just be fixed with an apology, I said honestly. It's going to take time. A lot of time. Sasha nodded, tears spilling over. I understand. I wish I could change what happened, but all I can do now is try to make up for it. The conversation continued in a similar fashion, full of apologies, explanations, and attempts at understanding. There was no sudden breakthrough, no dramatic reconciliation. It was simply the beginning of something that might lead to healing or might not. I could see that Sasha was genuinely remorseful, but my mother's regret was complicated, tangled in her own sense of pride and defensiveness. Before we left, Sasha reached out and touched my arm gently. I know it'll take time, but I really want to be a part of your life again, she said, her voice sincere. Even if it's just as a sister who's trying to do better. I looked at her, unsure of what to say. I wasn't ready to offer forgiveness, but I also wasn't ready to shut the door completely. We'll see, I replied quietly. But I need space. And I need to do this on my terms. My mother, too, seemed to accept that things wouldn't be resolved quickly. If you're willing to try, I am too, she said, her voice soft. I just want you to know that I do care, even if I haven't shown it well. As I left the cafe, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with uncertainty. I had heard the apologies I'd been waiting for, but I knew that words alone wouldn't heal the wounds. It would take consistent effort and a genuine commitment to change, things I wasn't sure my mother was fully capable of yet. Sasha, on the other hand, seemed determined to do better, but I knew that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, brick by brick. Back at Liam's house, I recounted the conversation to him and his parents. How do you feel? Liam asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I thought about it for a moment before replying. I'm not sure, I admitted. Part of me feels lighter, like maybe there's a chance to mend things. But the other part of me doesn't want to get hurt again. Linda nodded knowingly. It's okay to take it slow, she said. You've made it this far by protecting yourself. Just keep doing what feels right for you. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that reconciliation was not about going back to the way things were. It was about redefining relationships and setting boundaries that prioritized my well-being. I didn't have to forgive them immediately, and I certainly didn't have to let them back in completely, but I could give it a chance, on my own terms, at my own pace. It wasn't the closure I'd imagined, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. In the weeks following our meeting at the cafe, I found myself navigating a complex mix of emotions. I felt a sense of relief after finally hearing Sasha and my mother acknowledge the pain they'd caused. But the apology was just the first step, and I knew better than to expect a complete turnaround. While I was open to gradual healing, I remained cautious. I couldn't afford to let my guard down too quickly, especially after everything I'd been through. As time passed, I made a deliberate choice to maintain a careful distance. Sasha sent occasional texts, small attempts to reconnect, updates about her baby, or simple "how are you?" messages. I responded politely but briefly, keeping the conversations light. I wasn't ready to dive back into a deep sibling bond, but I also didn't want to completely shut her out. My mother's efforts were more erratic. Some days she'd send long messages filled with regret and promises of change, while other days she seemed distant, as if unsure of how to proceed. I responded in a similar manner, sometimes more open, sometimes reserved. I forgave her, not because I fully trusted her again, but because I needed to release the burden of resentment for my own peace of mind. The real turning point came one afternoon as I sat in my small room at Liam's house, reflecting on how far I'd come. I realized that the true lesson of the past year wasn't just about reclaiming the house or facing my parents. It was about learning to stand up for myself, to understand my own worth, and to protect my peace no matter the circumstances. For the first time in a long while, I felt free from the grip of my past. I understood that forgiveness wasn't about absolving others of their wrongdoing. It was about giving myself permission to move forward. And moving forward meant choosing relationships that were healthy, supportive, and built on mutual respect. I continued to invest in my friendships and in myself. Liam and his family remained a central part of my life, always there with encouragement and wisdom. I leaned into my studies, now fully committed to my business major, and looking ahead to future opportunities. I even started exploring the idea of buying more rental properties, using the lessons I'd learned to build something meaningful for myself. I also made time for new connections, allowing myself to form friendships that weren't tainted by old wounds. I joined a local real estate club, attended meetups, and even started dating again, cautiously, but with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. The world no longer seemed defined by betrayal or abandonment. It was full of possibilities. There were still moments of doubt, days when the past felt closer than it should. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. I had built a life that was my own, defined not by what others had done to me, but by what I had chosen to do with the cards I'd been dealt. As I stood on the threshold of the next chapter, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for my grandparents who had believed in me, for Liam's family who had been there when I had nowhere else to go, and even for the experiences that had tested me. They had shaped me, but they hadn't broken me. I knew that my relationship with my mother and Sasha would always be complicated. Trust, once shattered, takes time to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. But I was okay with that. I had learned that it was possible to love someone from a distance, to forgive without forgetting, and to protect my heart without closing it off completely. Looking back, I understood that this wasn't the ending I had expected. I hadn't imagined that my greatest lesson would come from such deep hurt, or that my strongest relationships would be formed from such unexpected sources. But it was the ending I needed, the one that allowed me to redefine what family, strength, and love truly meant. And so, I chose to move forward, not with anger, not with regret, but with resilience and hope for a future that was fully mine.